Yeah. See through it and all that.
They didn't set up.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what the new guy is.
Just like any other.
Johnson.
Okay, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Smashed it and everything. Well, I just not decide that. And I have no idea. Ones that are very much the same.
Good morning. Hi. I've been listening to the David's Wendler concert of Shimon, David's it really is. Yep.
To a
Yes.
Yes, it was just on the radio. CD all around the house, different ones.
yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody.
So
Very good, I think 20. I would say, and that's what his wife said, enough. Maida, thank you.
Sick of me? I'm sick of me.
Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. So nice to see everybody. So we are continuing every Shabbat until the end of June. Before COVID, we had the custom of not meeting in July and August, and we're going to continue that extremely enticing idea this year. Okay. I love Torah study, of course, but it is awful nice to have a little bit of a break, too. So, we are now moving to Immanuel Kant's fourth question. You remember his questions are, what ought I to do? For what can I hope? What does it mean to be human? And what can I know? And I put off the knowledge question until the end, because I think it's the most challenging of questions. What I want to do about this is to kind of give you an overview of the issues, build a context, and then to try to figure out how Kant's question can be affirmatively answered in terms of the Bible. What can I come to know from the Bible? Which is a different question than what can I come to believe? In other words, I can believe anything I want to. I can be wrong about my beliefs. Knowledge, at least according to many thinkers, if I say I know something, I can't be wrong. And knowledge is a connection between the knower and the known. What Irv said last week, the facts. The facts can be known. So to know something means I have to have access to the facts of what I claim to know. If I claim to know that the Cleveland baseball team is known as the Indians, I have a reality beyond my knowing, but I'm wrong. And therefore I can't claim to know it. I can continue to believe it. I mean, it's certainly possible to believe something's wrong, but I can't be wrong if I claim that I know something, I have to be right about it. And knowledge is a correspondence between the knower and the known. I know that the Cleveland baseball team is called the Guardians. Okay? And the question arises, what are the facts behind what the Bible tells us is true? Did God create the universe? I can believe it. I could not believe it. But if I want to know it, I have to know something beyond what the book tells me. I have to have access to the fact that God created the universe. God called Abraham and told him, go to the land that I will tell you. I can believe that. And maybe that's enough. I can disbelieve it. But if I want to know it, then what I claim to know has to be accessible to me so that I can check what I claim to know against the facts that I claim to know something about. Can I know something behind the claim that God called Abraham and told him, go to the land that I will show you? Well, one approach might be archaeology. Can I find evidence behind what the book says that there was an Abraham? That would be the first thing. Is there an Abraham? Well, archaeologists have discovered through the fossil record, in other words, there is some evidence out there about the past, that there were migration patterns in the 18th century before the Common Era, the alleged century in which Abraham lived. Migration patterns. Okay, maybe Abraham did go from one place to another as a part of the migration pattern. But can I know that Abraham was involved in that migration pattern? It's not enough for me to know that peoples were on the move. Can I know that Abraham was a part of it? I don't think anybody would dispute that the answer is no, unless we find a letter from Abraham to Sarah. Dear Sarah, we are going to move from Ur of the Chaldees to Haran. And then, God willing, we'll move from there to Canaan. That would clinch it. Or if we found some bill of lading which indicated the various purchases that somebody made.
Postcard to his father.
I'm sorry?
Postcard back to his father.
A postcard back to his father, yeah. I purchased 24 donkeys today because God told me to go to the land that I will show you. Other than that, however much we can discover general patterns into which Abraham might fit, if we don't have any first-hand evidence about Abraham, we can't know that he was part of that migration pattern. Let's suppose we could know that he was part of that migration pattern. Letter back to his father. We still don't know something very important, that God told him to do it. How would we come to know that? Let's suppose in that letter to Sarah, Abraham says, and God told me to go. How do we know Abraham was not hallucinating? He can tell us God told him, but we don't know that what Abraham describes is true. How can we know that Abraham actually heard from God and heard this imperative? We'd have to have some access to God. And not just as a belief, but as knowledge. So, you see the difficulty of the knowledge question when it comes to biblical claims. Do I know that David defeated Goliath? What would it take? I can believe that. I can even get a little bit of evidence for it. The sword, what would it be? The shield. Look, archaeologists have dug up things about the Philistine settlement on the east coast of Canaan, and maybe we can dig up some pottery. Perhaps we can even dig up some shields, a shield that Goliath might have used, and they can date it to 1000 before the Common Era, just at the time that David fought Goliath. That doesn't get us to that battle between David and Goliath. It just establishes a kind of context, and it's not nearly the information that we need. So, Kant's first three questions, for what can I hope, the Bible gives us evidence about that. We can learn what the Bible says about what I can hope for. What ought I to do? The Bible gives us evidence for what I ought to do. Take it or leave it. What does it mean to be human? The Bible gives us a lot of evidence about that. We spent quite a bit of time on that. What can I know is the most difficult question of all. So I'm going to suggest that there are at least two ways of answering that question in the affirmative. One I've already discussed. We could call it a foundationalist position. To know something requires foundations, and one of the foundations is I have to have access to the object that I claim to know. And I'm suggesting to you that it's difficult, if not impossible, to get there. There's also what I might call not a foundationalist. The foundationalist idea can be described in terms of a building. Think of a building with many floors and a foundation. If the foundation is weak, then the floors are going to totter. The floors are the implications of my assumptions. The foundations are my assumptions. I know I have access to the Abraham of history. And if I don't have access to it, what building can I construct to describe what it is that Abraham actually experienced and did? I'm not talking about the story now. I'm talking about the facts behind the story. So that the building image of knowledge has a problem. Look, if I want to describe the gravitational force in the universe, I can go out and examine the movements among bodies and try to come up with a formula about the way in which different bodies interact. There I have access to the facts behind what I want to know. I can see how bodies react to one another. I'm suggesting that we can't know the facts beyond the biblical claims. And in that sense, a foundationalist approach fails. An approach whose analogy is a building with a foundation and floors. There is another image which we might use to describe knowledge, and that is not a building but a web. And a web is the relationship of different objects in the web to one another, not the relationship of the web to something beyond the web, like the facts. This we might call a coherence theory of knowledge. That if a picture has coherence, that the objects in the web, in the picture, reinforce one another and create something powerful. Think of Rembrandt's late self-portraits. I don't have to know anything about the real Rembrandt behind the picture to know that the picture is powerful. Because Rembrandt, in his genius, has been able to put the elements together. And what does he do? He paints a very realistic picture of an old man. We call it a self-portrait. That is, we relate the picture to the person, but we don't have to. The picture itself, let's suppose we had no idea who was being depicted in that picture. Would that limit what we come to feel and know about the image that the picture depicts? Because the picture is an entity unto itself and need not have a referent to something beyond it. The picture is coherent. It gives us a powerful view of a real human being as that human being ages. And we're moved by it because it's coherent and compelling. And that's another way of knowing. In other words, if I want to know X, let's take it as a picture, or as a poem, or as a book, or as the Bible. That's X. A foundationalist view of knowing suggests that I have to know the facts beyond X. Because knowledge in this sense is a correspondence to what I claim to know, to that which I claim, that which is known. I can't know that Abraham was called by God unless I can get back to the actual event itself. But a coherence view of knowledge does not require X to be related to something beyond itself. So I'm suggesting that Kant's understanding, and I want to read a couple of things about this just to give us a background, that the classical understanding of knowledge is that knowledge is somehow related to facts beyond the knower. And if that's what Kant's question challenges us to come to see, the Bible fails. The Bible fails to answer Kant's question in the affirmative. What can I know by reading the Bible? And the answer is nothing. There are things I could know. I could know something about the wisdom of the psalmist. I can know something about the story that is told about Abraham, but that is all internal. The Bible purports to talk about not a fictional figure, but a real figure who was called by God. Isn't that true? If we only looked at the Bible as a story, and the story said God called Abraham and established a covenant with Abraham, but that claim is only internal to the story, how could we say we're still involved in Abraham's covenant? We can only still be involved in Abraham's covenant if the covenant is real. If somehow God really established a covenant. This is a very hard thing to determine and justify. So can the Bible give us no knowledge? In one sense, no. In another sense, the Webb model, the answer is potentially yes. So that's what I want us to do, is to look at the Bible in terms of its worldview and ask whether or not this is something that gives us knowledge. Knowledge here may be defined as different understandings of belief. I believe that they're still called the Cleveland Indians. Well, that's a false belief, period. I can believe something for which there is some evidence, more evidence, more evidence. Here's what I want to suggest, that the stronger the picture presented by a book or a poem, the more believable it is, and that at some point belief begins to merge with knowledge. In other words, what I want to suggest here is that, of course, the Bible is something that we can believe, but what kind of evidence internal to the book, not external, makes the picture more and more compelling? And there's no algorithm for this. We can't get to certitude. But we can begin to feel the power of the picture as it relates to something else, us. We find it more and more credible, more and more persuasive. And I think that's about all we can do. I don't think Kant's question can be answered in the affirmative, period. So that's kind of an introduction to this whole business. Maida?
I see a relationship to what you're saying to the Rembrandt painting.
Okay.
Because it is now proven that several so-called Rembrandts are not Rembrandts. So yes, we have this relationship with the painting, and we thought it was partially because the artist was the person who did Rembrandt was the artist who did it, and yet the painting retains its story, even though Rembrandt wasn't the artist.
You're talking about the coherence theory of truth, aren't you? Yeah, and not the correspondence theory. I thought you were talking about that the picture we know relates to the real Rembrandt.
Well, there's that also.
Is there?
Yeah, absolutely, I think.
But does it depict the real Rembrandt?
It is attempting to be like, enough sufficiently like Rembrandt.
Right.
So that we could say God created this story, Rembrandt created this story.
Yes, but we don't have any independent access to who Rembrandt was or what he looked like, do we?
Yes,
Do we? Others have painted him?
yes.
Okay, so that there are facts, knowable facts, beyond the Rembrandt's work. And we have evidence of those facts.
Exactly.
Right, so I've made a case for the coherence understanding of a picture, the Rembrandt self-portraits, the Bible. And I haven't focused on the possibility that there are correspondences between a work of art and the artist who is knowable independently of the painting. And so what you're agreeing with the coherence understanding, but you're also adding that unlike the Bible, we could know something about the facts beyond the picture.
Exactly.
Yeah. Stuart?
Shakespeare wrote plays that depict his understanding
Yeah.
of a bit of the facts,
Yes.
but they only reflect his understanding of a bit of the facts.
Right.
History, the same thing. Did Caesar say et tu, Brute,
Right.
or did he say et tu, meus filius,
Yes, yes. Yeah.
which Plutarch, I think, says?
Oh, does he? My brother?
My son.
My son. Okay. Oh, my son. Good.
Yes, filius, yeah.
So in other words, there are discernible facts beyond the telling, and how many of the facts do we know, but at least we can attempt to make a correspondence between Shakespeare's picture and what is the case. We probably can't get to a one-to-one correspondence that what Shakespeare said is true or is not true, but there's certainly things beyond the picture to which we have access.
Correct.
And I'm claiming here that such a claim cannot be made about the Bible, that we don't have access. Now, as biblical history develops, we do know, for example, so my basic claim about the early stuff is we have no access to the facts behind the depiction. And certainly when it comes to God, we have nothing. We certainly can have strong belief. This is not a claim about belief, but about knowledge. Now, as we get into the history of the kings of ancient Israel, the Omride dynasty, Omri and what's his name, Ahab, there are references outside the Bible to this dynasty. So there we have access. Now what do we know? That there must have been an Omri, and there must have been an Ahab. That doesn't yet tell us that what the Bible says about them is true, but it's moving toward the truth, especially if what we have is from the same era that the Bible says Omri and Ahab lived. Now, that's another piece of evidence that is moving us along the continuum toward knowledge. But we certainly can't know that Ahab said to Naboth, give me your piece of property. And Naboth said, you remember the story, Naboth said no. And Jezebel said to him, who's the king here? Take it. That we have no access to, though that there was an Ahab who may have been engaged with Naboth or may not have, looks like it's true. And the same thing about the Shakespeare history plays. There are the facts behind the story, and just how close a correspondence can we get? I take it that Theodore White's book on the 1960 election, something like that, we can check it out, because there's a lot of data about that. We can say that of the 1 million facts in that book, 950,000 of them correspond to what we know independently of it. Of course, how he put it together, what story he told, is his. I mean, the facts of history don't put themselves together in a narrative. There's always selectivity. It's the connect the dots idea, right? And in a period of history, if you think of it in terms of a picture with dots, there are 1 million dots for any era. And the historians, or the novelist for that matter, has to connect. You can't connect all of the dots, then you just have chaos. To tell a story, you have to be selective. And the selectivity is subjective. Because history doesn't tell us how to connect the dots. Yeah, right? What did the decline of the Habsburgs have to do with the advent of World War I? Well, history doesn't tell us that, but an historian might try to. Let me try to read a couple of things here which gets us into this knowledge question, and just give us some terminology. And then what I want to do is turn to the Bible itself. And let's put it this way. I like the connect the dots image. If we look at the Bible gives us 1 million data points, right? Take the first chapter. What did God do on day 1? Day 2? Each of these might be a dot in the picture. How might these dots be connected? What is the Bible telling us about the connection of the dots and the picture the connection yields, and what do we think about that picture? And then we'll go to the next episode and the next one and ask the same question in an attempt to develop a picture of the Bible's understanding of the world and ourselves. And do we find it compelling? We're not going to get a consensus on this. We're just going to try to see whether or not this is a way of dealing with Kant's question. What can I know? From, I might call it an internalist point of view, the picture itself. Of course, there are big questions that need to be answered. Chapter 1 has 1,000 dots, and we're going to try to connect some of them. The Bible has an exponential number of dots. 10 to the millionth power number of dots. So not only do we have to take an episode and examine what it's telling us, but we have to decide what episodes we're going to pick. Let's pick David. No, let's pick Solomon. No, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. These are the people to focus on to get the Bible's picture. And which of them should we select? It's arbitrary. It's subjective, isn't it? So that not only does each picture have complexity, which we want to look at, but which of the many pictures that the Bible creates for us do we want to choose to examine? And I take it if we were to go divide ourselves into subgroups, and each subgroup would have to pick the top 15 parts of the Bible, from which we're going to get the Bible's picture of what is discernible. Each group is going to come up with a different 15, won't they? There'll be some overlap. I guess Mount Sinai will figure in more than a couple. What about the death of Moses? Is that a significant dot of all the dots? Yeah, but is it one of the top 15? Well, if you're thinking about the question of what's the meaning of the death of Moses halfway through his journey, now we've elevated the significance of that dot. That Moses died isn't so important. That he dies at the end of Deuteronomy is a little more important. That he dies in the middle of his journey is more important still. That he dies because he sinned is it's not only important about Moses, it's important about what it means to be human. Do we get to check everything off our to-do list before we die? I mean, I suppose that one way of talking about a full life is that we're never going to finish all the elements on our to-do list. We always die while we still have things to do. Well, Moses still has things to do, and he doesn't get to do it. Not just because God doesn't want him to do it, but because Moses made his own destiny. How important is that dot? So there's a lot of arbitrariness here, but I think you will agree with me that just as Rembrandt's late self-portraits are among the greatest works of art ever created, not only for their technical skill, but because they tell us something about, guess who? Us. And how we understand our aging process. I mean, Rembrandt put all the warts and the wrinkles of an old man in the picture. He didn't idealize it. If we wanted to talk about what pieces of art tell us about ourselves in a perennial way, what would we choose? There are many, many, many possibilities. Guernica, it's about war. So that's our challenge. Don't you think it's a lovely challenge? Because now we're into, let's call it, the cognitive status of the Bible. What the Bible knows. And what the Bible readers might come to know if they take the Bible seriously. That's a very excellent question, isn't it? Even though what we come to know, we have to still be agnostic about whether or not that corresponds to the reality it describes. In that sense, the Bible can be fiction, but still deeply profound. Right? Like Middlemarch. Deeply profound. One of the greatest of all novels. And yet, Casaubon, is that the guy's name in the book? Who's the pedant who spends his life trying to finish a book and can't do it. There's no ever Casaubon. And yet, Casaubon's more real than my next door neighbor. So, the question, Jim?
In our current discussion, it seems we have to leave out the word faith.
Faith.
Is that true?
Well, I use the word belief.
Okay.
So if we say that belief and faith are synonyms, we've included it.
Yeah, but I think if I'm hearing everything we're doing right, we have to leave that out for now.
We have to leave it out. Yes, we have to leave it out, but not permanently.
Right.
Yeah, because we always have to, when I say leave, there are two ways of leaving it out. I can leave it at home, and therefore it has nothing to do with what we're doing here. Or I can put it on this table, in which case it hovers over our discussion. Because we never want to suggest that even though we're looking at what can be known, that that there still is something very important for us to keep in mind. That we can believe what we want to believe, and that the Bible might convey a powerful set of beliefs. I believe that God called Abraham. That's sitting here now. It's not at home. And while I'm asking, can we know this? I'm not ignoring the fact that I can always believe it. And belief here is not just something that's in my head. It informs the way I live my life. I mean, there is an existential element in our consideration, always with the Bible, but certainly this year. Because I have to ask myself, what should I do? Not only what does the Bible tell me I should do, but what can I hope for? You remember, in the last couple of weeks, we isolated through David Hartman's lovely essay, 2 forms of hope, right? I can despair that human beings can do anything, and I hope for God. The Bible gives us some warrant for that kind of thing. That's a possible biblical mode of hope. I can also think of the Teshuvah model. The Teshuvah model is, I can change my ways. I can come to acknowledge my obligations more and more, right? So the Bible yields stuff like that. Is it going to yield anything knowable? And faith is another issue. I can believe what I want. Irv.
It seems to me that the Bible is confronting the major challenge that every society has.
Yes, which is?
Society has to deal with human nature,
Yeah.
and human nature is not so admirable. And story after story of the Bible is telling you about the negative side of human nature, beginning with Cain and Abel, beginning with
Adam and Eve.
Adam saying, it isn't my fault, it was that woman's fault, you know, I'm not going to take responsibility. So all the way through, one story after another, this is our problem, guys. This is what human beings are like, and how are we going to figure out how to deal with this?
Yes.
And the authors of the Bible said, one way to do it is to presume that there is a God,
Yes.
which consists of everything,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to comport yourself according to the commitment to that concept, to that abstraction. That's the only way to do it. And that's a quick summary of a lot of books, but you know, it seems to me a logical one.
No, I think you've got a good point, and in a way you have given some elaboration of what I'm calling the coherence theory. That there is a God on a correspondence theory of knowing. To know that there's a God, I would have to have access to the God outside the claim of the book. And that's not your point. Your point is that the Bible's story can be understood in its own terms without having to know whether or not what the Bible claims to have happened, because the picture is powerful.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll summarize. I mean, the God that they're talking about is an abstraction. In my
The
mind.
God, what? Say that again?
Is an abstraction. It's not nothing concrete. That's what my monetary was telling us. But I mean, human nature is problematic. Always has been. Always will be.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point. Actually, last night for my Devar Torah, I talked about this in terms of Buffalo, what happened there last week. And I pointed out that the initial conditions of Genesis chapter 1, before anything is created, and the earth was formless and void, and darkness hovered over the face of the deep. That's before God, the Bible says God said, let there be light. So the initial conditions of reality are chaos and darkness. That's the Bible's realism. And I tried to extrapolate from there the darkness of human nature. which we see manifested over and over again. I tried to talk a bit about the conspiracy theories, the war on Christmas. That's both false. There's falsity there, and there's also truth there. What's false is there was no war on Christmas. The truth is that its power resides in the weaknesses of human nature. Our anxieties and our fears are subject to conspiracy theories. That's true. That's the truth. And the Bible knows that truth. It's just another way of saying in a different way what Irv, you just said. And Irv points out that one of the antidotes, one of the ways of dealing with it, is to assume there is a God. And I think that's true, but I think there are other ways too. The creation of law, the creation of institutions, predictability, which runs into problems. Monarchy is a way of organizing society, but it runs into problems. That's the so-called dialectic of the Bible. With every yes, there's a no. The prophets say we do have agency, and we better darn use it to lift up the poor and the fallen and so on. On the other hand, there's the darkness of human nature, which is fundamentally, in many ways, narcissistic and ego-centered, self-involved. So what do I care about the stranger? There's that dialectic. Care about the stranger, I see that I should, but on the other hand, we tend to think about ourselves. Bill, impatient.
Thinking much along the same lines as Jim.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, perhaps, in using the Bible as a field of knowledge, are you not sometimes trying to create the Bible as being knowledge sort of in a vacuum? Because it seems that the preparation to understand and respect the Bible as we do comes with a preset beliefs before you tackle the Bible, and that is, as Jim says, one of faith, one of belief, that it is important or it has a different meaning to us than if, say, some person in Mongolia found the Bible, picked it up, and the knowledge to him would only be maybe a history, a book. And so I think I don't think knowledge can exist in the vacuum, even using the Rembrandt painting. Mm-hmm. If you lived a life of installations and gross abstractions, would looking at Rembrandt have that same artistic meaning and feeling that it does to just people who have a different human experience? Yeah. And that's where I'm getting very lost in your argument.
Okay, that's very good, actually. So what you're suggesting, and you've suggested a lot there, is that what I know, or maybe more importantly, what I'm interested in knowing, has something to do with who I am, my culture, my predispositions, and so on. I thought another thing, and who can deny that? I mean, one of the things that is part of modern epistemology is the science of knowledge, what I can know. One of the elements of modern epistemology is that what I know and want to know has everything to do with what I'm interested in. It's not as objective an endeavor as I might have thought. It's not like science. And I think that's an important thing. I thought another thing you were saying, and I'm worried about this myself, so maybe I heard it in the sense that you weren't really saying it. You know the ancient myth of Procrustes. We've talked about Procrustes' bed. It's the story of an ancient individual. You know this, an individual who was an innkeeper in ancient Greece, and he had an inn at a crossroads between two roads that traversed the whole area. And inevitably, travelers who are moving from point A to point B couldn't finish the trip in one day, so they needed an inn to stay overnight. And they stayed overnight in Procrustes' inn, except all his beds were the same size. And so, if the bed were 5 feet, 5.5 feet long, and he got a 6-footer coming in, he would saw off half the body, half a length of the body, so that that body fit the bed. If the person were only 5'2", he would stretch the body to fit the bed. In other words, Procrustes' bed is fitting the phenomena you're interested in understanding to a preconceived notion of what is the case. And I thought what you were saying was I was engaged here in a Procrustean bed. I'm asking the knowledge question of the Bible. And maybe the Bible is not interested in the knowledge question. It's only interested in faith. So here's why the Procrustean bed, if it's true, if that's what I'm doing. What we're dealing with is Kant's questions. And Kant asks the question, what can I know? So, given that interest of ours, or maybe it's only mine, we have to face that question with respect to the Bible, which is our subject. I take it it's more than a Procrustean bed, because we're all interested, aren't we, in what can I know, and what is the epistemological status of the Bible. The Bible is telling us a lot of things. And the Bible is, I might call it, based on a realism, in the sense that it's interested in reality. And believers through the ages have believed that when the Bible says God gave the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, that's not just a story. That happened. That's knowable. It was a fact. Now, think about it. Think about it. I just pointed to the idea of covenant. It's a beautiful story of God creating a covenant with Abraham and Abraham's descendants. What a powerful story. Is there a covenant beyond the story? Are the Jewish people really in a relationship with God filled with promises and obligations? Is that what we think? That it's just a lovely story? Let's take a Christian issue. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son so that we can have life eternal. That's a claim the New Testament makes. What does it mean, gave his only begotten Son? It means gave him up. That Jesus' crucifixion created a reality. The end of our being in bondage to original sin. Just as the first Adam brought sin into the world, the second Adam, that's Jesus, took it away. Took our sins onto himself so that I am now in a relationship with God. I can't redeem myself from my own sin. It took an event. You know, the New Testament says that when Christ was crucified, the moment of the crucifixion, the curtains of the temple tore. What is that telling us? That it was an event. That it had resonance beyond itself. You know, if I give a sermon, we've faced this before. I mean, there have been times over the years when I've said something and the thunder's outside. And everybody goes, whoa, 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 whoa. Nobody believes it, but we all have this notion that something's being said has greater power if somehow there's a corroborating event beyond the saying of it. Now let's ask this question. Does the New Testament, does Christianity think that the crucifixion is just a story?
No.
Or is it a true, does it have efficacy beyond the story? In other words, there is something about the relationship of the story to events that gives it power, almost necessary power. Because we'd like to know, are we in a relationship with God or not? I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but the import of that story is that I'm describing what happened. The Ten Commandments, who'd made them up? A really bright guy. How do I know that's not possible? But the Torah is saying that they have ontological status. They are true and not just another version of what I ought to do. Because there are many versions of what human beings do. What's the greatest painting that was ever created? How do I know? There's no greatest anything. What are the greatest commandments? What? Pick one. If it's up to us, nobody is going to convince us that this and only this are the most important commandments. What the Bible says are the most important commandments are the most important commandments of the Bible. Why? Because God gave them, not some persona in a story gave them in the story. This is not just a story about the giving of the commandments. This is a story about the giving of the commandments. Isn't it? So the Bible in some way rests upon what actually happened. Doesn't it? And that's what believers believe. That God wrote the Bible. Documentary hypothesis, different documents. That's no problem for a believer. God wrote them all. There's an editor to put them together. That's not a problem. God inspired the editor. Yeah. And that's a way of gaining unique status for your book because it tells you the really real stuff. Stuart.
The opera Hara Janos begins with a sneeze.
I didn't know that.
Because the sneeze is supposed to mean everything that follows it is true.
I like
and
that.
really happened.
Wow.
And it's totally in the mind of the speaker. The whole thing, including meeting the Emperor of Austria.
So that it purports, the sneeze purports that this is real outside the mind of the speaker, but in fact it's not?
Yes.
It
correct.
purports to.
Yeah,
How do you know that, by the way? That the sneeze purports to?
because that's a Hungarian
Custom.
custom, yeah, belief.
That a sneeze tells you that what follows is true.
Yeah.
I like that. Wow. So that opera raises the epistemological question.
Right? I hadn't thought of it that way.
Is it true or is it just part of the imagination of a brilliant creator?
Right.
I love that. I love that. I love that. Wow. Gee. Of course, the genius of the producer is to get us to believe what he or she contrived is true. You know, when Siegfried breaks Wotan's sword, Siegfried is Wotan's grandson, you're not going to tell me that didn't really happen. I mean, we react to it as if, oh my God, really? Oh, well, that was just Wagner. That's not true. That's not the way it's accessed, right? That's the genius of a great producer. Okay, so I like this discussion because what we're raising here is complex and problematic, and maybe it will yield nothing, but I feel challenged by Kant's question, and it's another way of thinking about what the Bible is. Why has the Bible had so much importance down through the ages, even to us. I take it that if I were to ask you to vote on this following question, I'm not going to ask you to do it. How many here believe that God produced the Bible? That the Bible are the very words and letters of God? I take it nobody in this room believes that. Yeah, we might move it down a notch. Not words and letters, but inspiration. I take it more of us would say, yeah, the Bible was inspired. No, let's go down even further. Written by human beings like you and me, only they were greater. I take it most of us feel just that. But even though we might have a consensus on that issue, we still are interested in what the Bible has to say because it's a book filled with power. And Kant's question raises the question of its status. Is it merely a powerful story? Does it link onto something? And if it's just a powerful story, how powerful is it? I think that's our question now. How powerful, comprehensive, coherent, telling is the Bible's story, understood internally, and not asking, yeah, but did God write it? Okay, let me read a thing or two just to open up the question. I'm going to read from a very interesting book called The Believer and the Modern Study of the Bible. That's just our book, isn't it? The Believer and the Modern Study. For thousands of years, the Bible was studied exclusively by people of faith who regarded it as a sacred text given by God. Considerable theoretical and practical importance was ascribed to this study and the literature it produced. Over generations, a worldview developed that this study required the reader to be totally committed to a belief in the integrity and the sanctity of the text. Integrity, namely coherent, that the whole book fits together as a non-contradictory whole. That even though you could find two stories of creation, two stories of the flood, they are coherent. They're not contradictory. Over generations, and sanctity means created by God. Over generations, a worldview developed that this study required the reader to be totally committed to a belief in the integrity and the sanctity of the text and its consequent immunity from human error. That's a strong statement about a traditional understanding of the Bible. Sources that reflect critical thinking here in the neutral sense of stepping back and asking some questions. Is what the Bible really says true? How should I understand? Instead of accepting it as it comes through firm belief, critical thinking of anything is stepping back. Not necessarily to undermine, but to question. Sources that reflect critical thinking on the composition of the biblical corpus can already be found in classical rabbinic and medieval Jewish literature. For example, in the commentaries of Abraham ibn Ezra and Rabbi Judah the Pious. So critical thinking is not just a modern phenomenon. However, I'll give you an example. In chapter 12 of Genesis, right after Abraham is called, the Torah says the Canaanites were then in the land. What does that mean? Then but not now? If it means then but not now, the putative author of it has to have written much later. And maybe it wasn't written by Moses. That's a question that Abraham ibn Ezra asked. What does then but not now mean? So he was already questioning the authorship of the entire Bible, which this Torah had to come through Moses. And if it was written later, when the Canaanite was no longer in the land, after Moses, this calls into question the Mosaic authorship of the Torah. Already, Abraham ibn Ezra was doing this. However, this author goes on to say, these early articulations were not sufficient to challenge the basic traditional assumptions about biblical books, their origins, composition, and transmission. In other words, a few little worries about the integrity of the text didn't undermine the basic conviction that the text had integrity in terms of origin. Where did it come from? It came from God. Composition. Who wrote it down? One person, not many. And transmission. Think about the whole issue of transmission. I mean, if I write a letter and then as a draft and then go back and copy it, there's a good chance that copying my own letter is going to either omit something or maybe add something the original didn't have, misspelling. In other words, transmission, even from here on my desk to here, is subject to error. How much the more so the transmission of the Bible for 2,000 years down to our own day. So I have to believe at least two things if I'm a traditionalist. That the Bible is given by God to Moses, and that from Moses the transmission is without error. If I assume error, then I do know, if there are errors, that what I'm reading didn't come from Mount Sinai. I can believe that God gave the Torah to Moses, and Moses got it just as God wanted, said it, and that now at the initial moment of revelation, there's your Bible, and it's all from God. It takes another leap of faith to believe that what Moses wrote down is what I have 3,000 years later. And yet a traditionalist believes both. Torah min hashamayim, there are two ideas here. Torah min hashamayim, the Torah from God, that's the first step. And Torat Moshe, the Torah that Moses wrote down and transmitted to Joshua and the elders of the prophets and so on. Those are two big leaps, aren't they? And yet a traditionalist does believe them. That's what's powerful here, I think. Maida?
In what language was that original Torah?
That's it. There you go. I mean, the assumption is the Hebrew of that day. We do know the Hebrew of the day because we've dug up, Frank Moore Cross was an epigraphist talking about documents. And there is a different script, a so-called round script. And we have evidence of that round script up to a certain point. And then we have the Assyrian script. The Assyrian script is the script of our Hebrew. So we do know from documents down through that era what the lingua franca was of that era. Part of the Bible is written in Aramaic, late books, because of the impact of our existence in Babylonia.
So we adhere to this script on the Ten Commandments that is seen everywhere now, even though we don't know what the actual translation would have been of that original language.
I guess that's true. I mean, if you assume a realistic view, Moses got the Torah in about the year 1300, 12, maybe later, 1220. I'm sure that Frank Moore Cross and these guys know what the letters look like at that point. They can probably tell us. Let's go on a little bit. The appearance of critical biblical scholarship in the 18th century stunned religious readers of the Bible. You get the flow here. There are certain assumptions of traditional readers. Sanctity, integrity, inerrant transmission, and so on. Now we have the advent of critical Bible scholarship. Thomas Hobbes, Spinoza, who are beginning to ask questions about the Bible. What do contradictions in the text mean, for example? The appearance of critical biblical scholarship in the 18th century stunned religious readers of the Bible. For the first time, systematic use was made of scientific analytical tools to study the Bible. Scholars presented methodological approaches and conclusions regarding the composition of the text that contradicted the naive assumptions of preceding generations. Now, I think the author is unfair here. He's calling them naive. And the perspective, he's writing from a perspective in which critical assumptions go without saying. There are multiple authors, the issue of transmission is a serious one, and so on. So the traditionalists don't think they're naive. The traditionalists, they're true. Confronted with the cogency of biblical scholarship and cognizant of the challenges that this research entailed, those who believed in the divine origin of the Bible were forced to respond. Okay? So these are the four responses that this author thinks that those who care about the Bible made choices. Bewildered believers confronted these challenges in several ways. One approach was to ignore the conclusions of this research or to utterly reject them while scorning the world of science and ridiculing academic scholarship in general. Anti-science, anti-progress. These things might be corrosive to our understanding. We're going to ignore and reject them. This extreme conservative reaction to the challenge of biblical criticism reinforced a wholesale negation of the Enlightenment at larger implications. The Enlightenment, in a word, is an elevation of the role of reason in society. Not faith, but reason. Proponents of this rejectionist approach, who eventually came to be known as Haredi Jews in the Jewish community, isolated themselves from the surrounding culture and lacked any interest or ability in discerning between its positive and negative aspects. A wholesale rejection of a scientific approach to these things. On the other extreme, see that you have two things now. You have tradition and you have modern reason. And there are two extreme approaches. Total observance and rejection of reason, or the rejection of tradition and casting your lot with reason. Okay? So the first approach was on this extreme. Ignore, reject modern critical approaches. On the other extreme was the belief that the Enlightenment demanded the abandonment of religion, or at least its radical reform. So this is a discussion about the reaction to criticism of the Bible. And of course, we need to take this into account when we think about the claims of the Bible. What's their status? A third approach developed primarily in Central Europe in the 19th century. Its proponents chose to study the conclusions of biblical research to glean what could be accepted from a theological point of view and to reject with scholarly arguments those positions that appeared to contradict Jewish faith as they defined it. In other words, this is the beginning of a middle ground. I can see the power of the modern study of the Bible. I'm going to embrace some of it until it begins to erode fundamental faith commitments. And that's where I don't let modern scholarship have any role. Okay, so it's sort of a middle ground. An outstanding example of this is Rabbi David Zvi Hoffman's Torah commentary. While this approach attracted many followers, it's kind of a compromise. It received criticism from both sides. The Haredi world objected to all contact with the Jewish Enlightenment and science. So the extreme thought any concessions to scholarship lets the nose of the camel under the tent. Be careful. Once you let the nose in there, the camel's in the tent. And the academic world doubted the intellectual integrity of those who approached biblical study with preconceived assumptions about the nature of revelation and divine inspiration that limited their freedom of inquiry. The one group disagreed that you only accept science so far. The other group said, why are you holding out for certain basic beliefs, like that God revealed the Bible? As long as you're now beginning to study the Bible from a critical, historical point of view, why do you bracket out certain ideas that we don't allow modern study? So that approach, that compromise approach, was attacked by both sides. A fourth approach has gained ground among religious intellectuals and academics, but it has yet to make a significant impact on the religious public. This approach recognizes the legitimacy of the questions posed by biblical scholarship. It accepts the underlying rational assumptions that are necessary to answer these questions without perceiving this acceptance as a challenge to the belief in God, acceptance of the Bible's sanctity, or commitment to observance. In other words, we can ask all the questions, but we still are committed to the power of the Bible and the observance of the commandments. This approach does deal directly with biblical criticism, yet it allows the possibility of engaging in academic research without, in advance, restricting potential conclusions. In other words, I could accept all the conclusions of modern critical scholarship, that there are many voices in the Bible, that there are errors in the Bible, that God didn't write the Bible, and still feel that the basic values of the Bible, the basic commandments of the Bible, are still incumbent upon me to take seriously. Proponents of this approach attempt to clarify, theologically, conceptually, philosophically, how to live a religious life based on belief in God and the observance of the commandments without basing that belief on factual knowledge that can be refuted by science. I take it it's this fourth option that we are working on. It's possible how to live a religious life, defined any way we want to, down to nothing, based on a belief in God and the observance of the commandments, taking something powerful from the Bible, without basing that belief on factual knowledge that can be refuted by science. Science tells us that the world was not created 4,000 years ago in 7 days. I mean, no credible scientist believes that anymore. The fossil record alone, which is factual, tells us that the world is what? Millions and millions of years old. So we can accept science, this fourth position holds, without rejecting, let us say, the power of Genesis chapter 1. If Genesis chapter 1 is refuted by science, and I believe that the Bible's claims are reflected in reality, that's the question, then I've got a big problem. Because I think the creation story is factual. And yet the facts refute the factual reality of what the Bible tells us. So what am I supposed to do? I can accept the facts of science. Look, we're talking about the relationship between the book and the facts. And the book tells us created in 7 days. The fact says no. But can I accept both what the Bible tells us in Genesis 1 without rejecting what science tells us? And the answer is what we've arrived at, if we've arrived there, and that is the knowledge that the Bible gives us is not the connection between the book and the facts, but internal to the book itself. What is the power of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony? The power resides in the symphony itself. I happen to have read a couple of analyses of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, the first movement. It's astonishing what Beethoven did there. It's a revolutionary work. One can understand why it has endurance as one of the greatest works of all time and one of the most revolutionary moments in history of music from the thing itself. Look at what Beethoven accomplished there. The power is not in some correspondence between Beethoven's symphony and reality, whatever that might be. In this case, the analogy begins to break down a little bit. But internal to the thing itself. Haven't you listened to a piece of music or read a piece of poetry and it shouts out its power? It just, you can't ignore its power, which comes from the thing itself. Not that Rossini was such a great person. It's not, oh my gosh, it's great because Rossini is great. No, it's great because it's great. And that's the question of what's internal to the book itself. And this is what the fourth option of dealing with modernity has to tell us. I'm going to read it again. Proponents of this approach attempt to clarify how to live a religious life. We might want to say how to live an ethical life, a good, a valuable life, based upon certain beliefs, like a belief in God, and the observance of the commandments, without basing that belief on factual knowledge that can be refuted by science. We don't ignore science. Is there still a powerful Bible left, which makes claims that science rejects? And we can do both if we don't think of the Bible as answerable to science. It's something else. And what else is it? For instance, the historical authenticity. So what it is that science, the science of Bible now tells us, is that the historical authenticity of various parts of the Bible are deeply problematic. The history of the Bible tells us is questionable. We have to accept that as the result of scholarship. The integrity and unity of each of the biblical books. The Talmud does ask the question, who wrote the Bible? And one of its answers is Samuel wrote the books of Samuel and also the book of Ruth. That Jeremiah wrote his book and the book of Lamentations. One author, and the book is the product of one author. Modern scholarship of the Bible shows us that there are layers of authorship in these books. That the unity, authorial unity of a book is denied. Did Moses write the 5 books of Moses? Up until the year 1700, every Jew, every Christian said yes. Now it's obvious that the answer is no. Does that undermine the power of the Bible? The answer here is no. We can accept science and not ask the Bible to do what science does, relate theories to facts. That's what science does. There's a hypothesis. How do you know whether the hypothesis is true? You do experiments. You look for the evidence outside the hypothesis. Can we do the same thing with the Bible? The problem with that is we can't do it. We don't know the facts outside the hypotheses, the statements of the Bible. And they might conflict with what biblical scholarship tells us. Okay, so here's what I want to do starting next week. I want to look at the picture that the Bible creates for us. And remember the analogy with the dots. How many discrete items are there in the Bible? Millions. So, trying to know what picture the Bible tells us means connecting the dots. But not to connect all the dots, but to connect those that create the picture. You know the books we used to, as kids, were connect the dots. But the dots were numbered, so that you knew what picture that the graph wanted to emerge. In the study of history, in the study of the book, the dots aren't numbered. We have to, of the million dots, we have to lift out the big 50. That's step one. What are the events in the Bible that deserve attention? Once we have our list of 50, let's suppose we circle them in this screen. Now the next point is, how are they to be connected? Let's number them, 1 through 50. I start with 1. I can connect it to 2. I can connect it to 3. I can connect it to 49. After I've connected it to 49, which you're going to challenge, because you think it ought to be connected to number 2. Now I have the next dot. What do I connect 49 with? Isn't this a lovely question? What are the decisive dots, elements, episodes in the Bible? That's a matter of a decision. The Bible doesn't give us a key. By the way, here are the top 50. No, it doesn't come with a key. So not only what are the chief elements, but how are they what's the story? Is it merely chronological, or is it conceptual? I want to connect the dots that deal with law to get a picture of the Bible's view of law. That's conceptual, not chronological. It'd be easy just to say the first dot is the first thing that happens. The next thing that happens that I pick comes next, and so on and so on. But chronology, what does chronology tell us about meaning? How does the clock go? The clock goes tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. No, it doesn't. The clock goes tick, 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 tick. To take tick, tick and to make it sound like tick-tock is our imposition of order on phenomena that are not themselves order. If we hear tick-tock, we know that this is what we have come to need. So the imposition of order is a human factor. It's a human idea. The biblical author has done something about that, but how are we going to create? Let's suppose item 1 is tick, and item 2 is tock. So now we've connected 1 and 2. But it's our connection. It's not inherent in the connection 1 and 2, which are just discrete dots. So here's what I want us to think about. I'd like you to think about it too. What are the basic elements in the Bible's corpus? If we're going to understand what the Bible tells us, what should we lift out to give us in a shorter form than reading thousands of pages what the Bible's all about? And how might we connect them? Think about this. I'm not asking you to get the 50, but why doesn't everybody think about what might be your top 5 events or episodes? It might be the book of Psalms, which is not an event or an episode. You might say Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. So when I say events or episodes, I'm not limiting it just to things that happen, but to also things that are. The book of Lamentations, where Jeremiah is allegedly weeping over the destruction of Jerusalem. What about the power of destruction in the lifetime of a people as a major event that needs to be responded to creatively if the people is not going to disappear? So you could easily say the Book of Lamentations is one of your dots without its being an episode. You see? So I think anything in the Bible can serve as a dot. If a Martian were to come down now and listen to what's going on, what do you mean dots? So we've got our own language here. Try to do that. Let's see what the top 5 events are or elements of the Bible are for you. Maybe you'll write them down and give them to me before we start. And we'll start by my reading all or some of them, just to see what story, so to speak, you find most fundamental in the biblical corpus. Yeah,
So, in order to do this well, we have to know what's in the Bible in advance. By having read it off.
That's our assignment this week.
But we all have a generalized knowledge of it. But I don't think it's so much about the content, which is what you're talking about. I don't think it's so much about the dots.
yes,
As it is about the lines between the dots. To understand Beethoven's symphony.
yes.
Do you need to know how to read music? Do you need to understand the structure of it? Do you need to know whether the clarinet in the first row is playing the right note or not? No, you just have to have a certain emotional depth to yourself so that when that music comes to you, you're open enough to react to it. And it's what Bill was saying.
Exactly.
It's what you bring to
Right.
an orchestra concert, or when you go to hear it, how open you are to receive that music.
Right.
Or how much you can concentrate at the moment to follow the path that the composer is leading you down. So is religion not the same way? Isn't it what we bring to it? When you go to a service on Friday night, are you thinking about, is my car going to start when I get in it and to go home, or whether I have to stop at the grocery store, or are you open enough to receive whatever blessings or what's around you?
Good. So here is one ground rule for doing this. While you're thinking about this, do it at home so you don't have to think about how am I going to drive home later. I'm teasing you. Look, what you're saying is really good. Look, I think in order to discuss Beethoven's symphony, you need to know something of what happens in that thing so that you can make a choice. Or on the other hand, if you know it just by hearing it, there are certain moments that to you stand out. So there is a subjective element, and that's why I'm not just asking Arthur to give us his 5 basic dots, because we all are going to do this differently, depending on what we know, what we've enjoyed, what our interests are, and we'll come to see. I mean, in a certain way, this may emerge as a sort of bell curve. That is, the more an event is mentioned by us, the higher up it goes on the curve. So, there's an event that 8 of us talked about. Here's an event that only 1 person talked about. And what will we learn from this? We'll learn what emerges from our times studying this text as the significant stuff. I mean, our opinions, because we've been here a long time, and even those of us who haven't been here a long time have an opinion, we'll create something that's interesting. Don't you think? Here's my guess. Nobody is going to cite the book of Obadiah.
Everyone knows it, that's right.
The book of Nahum, 2 Chronicles. I don't think anybody's going to be there. I doubt if the book of Exodus is going to remain undotted in some way or another. You think I'm right about this? Yeah. So, doesn't matter if we don't know the entire thing. I don't know the entire thing. You asked me what the book of Nahum, what's 1 Chronicles. I couldn't tell you. Tell us the story of the book of Ezra. I've dipped in and out of the book of Ezra, but I couldn't give you a significant, our knowledge is all right along. I know this, I don't know that. And see what we come up with. It'll be animated by interest, that's for sure, but I'll bet there will be some similarities. Even if each item on each list is not replicated by anybody else, that itself will be interesting. Let's suppose the graph looks like this. Nothing emerges in more than one individual stuff. What will that tell us? It'll tell us a lot of things. That it's very hard to get a coherent picture of the Bible. And that lots of things count as a dot. And therefore we ought to be skeptical about lifting out the picture that the Bible seeks to have us know. That'll be a big conclusion, wouldn't it? So we would arrive next week at the Bible has a lot of pictures, none of which emerges very well. Let's give it up and do something else until the end of June. Okay. All right. Try to do it. I'm not going to ask how many did it. Put them up here and we'll take a little look at it. Maida?
Do you want specific verse?
Whatever you want. Whatever you want. The Exodus from Egypt.
Okay.
Chapter 14, verse 30. Either way. Whatever works. Shabbat Shalom.
First time in 25 years you've given us hope.
What's that? What's that? I didn't hear you.
First time in 25 years that you've given us hope.
Exactly. Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, I can hold her
But I'll be That's okay.
It's more than
Thanks.
less than 5.
How are you?
This Shabbat Shalom.
We'll have to do it twice next week.
As we were starting down the path, it occurred to me that we're watching very quickly through the and I was up carrying the dog around.
Yes, it does, you know why? Well, you know, that's a given.
I mean,
Well, we started the discussion on this, we got to phase out because if you want to go specific on facts, really you should throw religion. I understand it's what they're saying, but the fact is, it applies because they read it as a Well, I've always looked at it like this, I mean, not just today, for many, many years. Now he's a professor in Arizona. Science, he's really up there, he knows all this stuff, right? He's right. And he gave a speech in August 15, 20 years ago. So what they said to me was, at some point, there's something we're not doing. And we never were. And I'm just glad it happened.
It's talking now, compared to last week, this is going, the landscapers want mulch on it this year. So it's like, bury everything again. So, I just want to thank you.
Like I believe
Thank you very much.
The results have been very,
good to see you.
my pleasure, always.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I have a Christian friend. I maybe didn't figure like my neighbor. Oh, she's grateful. I like her in her own way.
But that's not the same thing as having your vote in question.
Yeah, yeah. And everybody, you don't find it in those people right to anyone. It's not totally true either. They do it, but they do it.
Well,
They don't do it.
I studied under Rabbi Klein, okay, their function was to bring people in who were not Orthodox and answer somebody's email. But I just said, you feel this blessing of the life routine of the day, and you get, being able to say that, it was like a taffy pull. I was ever come along, I had slipped into once in a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, they.
Well, that's traditional.
Yeah.
I think if you talk
That's
to
good.
the.
Well, it's nice to see you. I hope you keep coming back.
Didn't you bring a jacket?
No,
I
I
like it
went,
cold.
brought it in the car, but it was so hot outside.
Yeah, but it's never hot in here.
I know, I'm sitting here, telling myself
So
not to
anyway,
get
just
cold.
let me know what day, I'll bring it over.
All right, so, you can bring it over Sunday or Sunday afternoon. I'm going to church in the morning.
Good for you.
So it's really nice to
You
get.
know, did you see the notice?
Talk about these feelings that we have,
Um,
even though we're moving on,
Rabbi
we're doing
Klein.
things that we love.
Invited me, instead of having his, which is what I was trying to do, his
And
traditional adult education study at 11 on Sunday.
Yeah.
He has to go
and I
to
think
church.
so much about that.
Which one you want?
Elizabeth Baptist Church. It's in,
Oh, really?
and
A Baptist, that'd be
they're
fun.
doing it because, yeah, they're doing it because,
Well, it's an emptiness for me because, well.
for solidarity.
I mean, I'm just describing my own.
Right,
feelings.
right.
It might be different.
And-
Yeah. We were together
And,
since,
and
I met him when I was just.
and community outreach, I don't know what other, is it,
And that was it.
on Thursday night, I went to the racial justice task force. The racial justice
Okay.
Zoom meeting,
So that's what
okay?
it's an
Because I like to look that way.
feel like, we always talk.
And,
Right.
and I just about
Yeah,
think that's,
yeah, that's
it was all too heavy
Aside from his
to
physical.
the same books that they were reading,
I mean,
you know? And then they changed
everybody in there.
read a book of fiction, so I liked it a lot. So I tuned into the meeting, and there's one black person.
The funny thing is, I'm sitting
And
somewhere,
she responded to something I said,
I look at the chair next to me,
um,
and I've got papers on the chair, and I looked at
please
the
accept
coffee
my,
table, and I've got
my
papers on the
regrets
coffee
and my
table,
sympathy
and I just said,
for what
I
happened to
know,
your people.
I know, this would drive me crazy. And I will get you, I promise, it's going to get me, this is what I can.
No one
And
can.
deal with it.
So I have my dining room set up,
Just because they were
and then I have another
Just
table.
what happened. And she,
So everybody's deciding where they want to sit.
started to
And I,
talk
you know,
after that
Here is
response.
chair with
She
my
started to
at
talk
the
about
table.
how difficult it was.
My son-in-law said to me,
In terms of
you want us to
Since she
sit
was
with
broken
me?
down.
I said, well, sit here, it's chair.
Well, I-
Exactly, you don't, but it, apparently it helps to have, the sympathy
Yeah,
of the
sure.
community and other people.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether
Spreads
this,
the grief.
I don't know whether
But, you
this
know,
response on the rabbi's part was directly related to that incident
I don't know. To me,
or not.